Now let us give our attention to our speaker while he speaks to us on Middle East tensions, the Bible perspective.
Good afternoon, my dear young people, brethren and sisters. On the 7th of October this year, at around 6:30 a.m. local time, Hamas announced that within a span of 20 minutes, it had fired over 5,000 rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel. The attacks were specifically timed to coincide with the Jewish holidays of Sukkot, or the Feast of Ingathering, and Simchat Torah. And they caught Israel by surprise. However, Israel soon gathered itself and retaliated, with the Israeli Defense League launching Operation Swords of Iron. The Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, said, "We are at war." And he threatened to turn all the places where Hamas is organised and hiding into cities of ruins. He called Gaza itself the city of evil. And since that date, the war between Israel and Hamas has never left our headlines. Even before the war, rarely did a week go by without the conflicts and tensions between Israel and its neighbours making the news. Unrest between the Jews and the Arabs, with Jerusalem being a particular hotspot of tensions in this area. Many of you know that the state of Israel, or that the country of Israel, as we know it today, is actually a relatively young nation. It came into being 75 years ago in 1948. But ever since that time, unrest has been evident. The State of Israel was formally declared on the 14th of May 1948. But in the morning of the very next day, an Arab coalition of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria and Iraq invaded this new country of Israel. That war was to last 10 months. Israel was a new country. It was outgunned, it was outnumbered. But remarkably, they survived that war. In fact, they did more than survive. They were able to expand the area of land under their control. On the screen here, we can see the orange colour that indicates the area of land under Israel's control prior to the war, with the green showing the Palestinian land. By the end of the war, look how much larger the orange area is and how much smaller the green area. The green now being two separate, distinct areas. On the Mediterranean coast, the Gaza Strip, which we know much of in our day and age, don't we? And on the west bank of the River Jordan that runs down the middle there, that the area of land known as the West Bank. So that was 1948. There were various other skirmishes through the years, but then in 1967 the Arab nations invaded once again. Now on this occasion, Israel launched a preemptive strike, crippling the Egyptian Air Force. And what followed was a war that lasted just 6 days, from the 5th to the 10th of June. Israel was once again victorious and was able to extend its territory even further, taking in all the land shown in red on the screen there. Then in 1973, the Arabs joined forces once again to attack Israel. This time there were many more nations involved, chiefly Egypt and Syria, but supported by Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya, Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Cuba and Sudan. All in all, around 1 million troops set against Israel's 400,000. The war started on the 6th of October 1973, another holy day for Israel, the day of Yom Kippur. That's 50 years and 1 day before the current war commenced. It took Israel 3 days to organise their forces, once again being caught off guard. But then it was able to quickly stop the advancing forces and even push back against them. It made further inroads into the territories of the invading nations, particularly in the areas marked red, into Syria in the far northeast and into Egypt in the west. Although, as we know, much of that land has subsequently been given back and surrendered to other nations. And really those conflicts that we've spoken of there set the scene for the years that followed, including today's war. But have you ever wondered, why does this antagonism exist between Israel and the Arabs? We take it for granted. It's always been there as long as we've been alive, but where did it come from? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back to, ultimately, the very origins of the Jewish and the Arab peoples. Now, we as Christadelphians base our beliefs on God's Word, the Bible. And as our title suggests, it is the Bible's perspective of the Jews and Arabs that we will be primarily considering this afternoon. So please, open your Bibles and come with me to the first book, that is Genesis, and we'll look at chapter 12 in a moment. Towards the end of Genesis chapter 11, we're introduced to a man called Abram, or Abraham, as he's also called. Abraham is one of the most important characters in the Bible. He was a man who believed in God, and he tried his best to obey God's commands. Let's look at the opening verses then of Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So we read there that God gave Abraham certain promises, but they were conditional. If Abraham obeyed God, then he and his descendants would be greatly blessed. In the 13th chapter, we are shown a little more detail regarding these promises. From Genesis 13 and verse 12, we see that Abraham was living at the time in the land of Canaan, and that's the area of the Middle East that we would call Israel today. Looking then in chapter 13, and let's read from verse 14. Genesis 13, verse 14, And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art, northward and southward, and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. And so the key point we want to take away from those verses there is that land that Abraham dwelt in, that land of Canaan, now called Israel, was to be given to Abraham and to his descendants. So who were his descendants? Well, in the years that followed, Abraham had 2 sons. He married a woman called Sarah, who is also called Sarai in the Bible. Unfortunately, Sarai was not able to have children. And so his first son was by a woman called Hagar, who was Sarah's maidservant. Now, it might seem strange to us in our day and age for a man to have more than one wife and for a man to marry his wife's servant. But this was not uncommon in the times that we're speaking of and in the area of the earth, that these things, the Middle East as we call it today. Now, this son that was born to Abraham and Hagar was called Ishmael. However, later on, God brought about a miracle, and Abraham did have a son by Sarah. And that son was called Isaac. Now, Isaac was to be a special son. Just to come on a little bit further in Genesis to chapter 17, we read of him in Genesis 17, and we'll take verse 19. Genesis 17, verse 19. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. So we see here that the promise that Isaac would be born to Abraham and Sarah, and indeed as the verses continue we read that did take place. But we see that it was through Isaac that these promises, this covenant that we have been reading of, would be fulfilled. Let's go a little bit further into Genesis chapter 22, please, because in the context of Abraham and his son Isaac, Genesis 22 is a very significant chapter. Here we read of what is possibly the greatest test of Abraham's faith. It was a test that proved to God that Abraham would really obey God no matter what. So going in at the start of Genesis 22, we read, And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt or prove Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. So God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, to kill him. And Abraham duly obeys, verse 3. And Abraham rose up early in the morning. There was no delay. He rose up early in the morning, saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. Just come down to chapter 2, verse 9. And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. Now at this point, God, or at least an angel of God, steps in and tells Abraham to stop. Abraham had proved to God that he was obedient, that he would indeed have killed his son if that's what God wanted. And so we see this special relationship, these special promises that we saw earlier, are through Isaac. In time, Isaac had a son called Jacob. whose name was later changed to Israel. Israel had 12 sons, and it's from these 12 sons that Israel, or the Jews, descended. Ishmael's descendants, as we shall show a little later, were to become the Arab nations. So there's some background about these people, particularly Isaac and Ishmael, and we'll, as we said, we'll return to those in a few moments. We thought about the people. What then about the city of Jerusalem? We noted earlier that it's a specific hotspot for the tensions and the violence in the Middle East. Why should this be? Once again, we can look to our Bibles to see about this. Come with me to the First of Kings, please. The First of Kings and chapter 11. Because we read in a number of places in the Bible that Jerusalem itself is very special to God. Now, we don't need to be concerned about the context of the verses in 1 Kings 11, but we can just read from 1 Kings 11 and verse 32. We read here about Jerusalem. 1 Kings 11 and verse 32. But he shall have one tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. So that's God speaking there. So we see there that Jerusalem he has chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. And if we come down to verse 36 of this chapter, and unto his son will I give one tribe, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen me to put my name there. And so we see this idea of God putting his name in Jerusalem. Now, we don't have time to consider God's name in particular detail, but God's name speaks of his character, but also of his plan and purpose with this earth, a plan and purpose we will touch on a little later. I hope, therefore, we can start to see why Israel and particularly Jerusalem are so important to the Jews. The Jews' beliefs are based upon a portion of the Bible we call the Old Testament, some of the words of which we've just been reading from. And based upon these words, for the Jews, Israel is their promised inheritance. We saw that right back with Abraham, didn't we, in Genesis 12. And we saw that those special promises came through Isaac in Genesis 17. And we've seen how that those Isaac's descendants were indeed Israel. And so it is that this land of Israel, according to the Bible, is promised to the Jews. And Jerusalem, as we've seen, is a special city to the God of the Bible, and therefore it is the most holy city of the Jews. So that's why Israel and Jerusalem is important to the Jews. What about the Arabs? Because clearly, from the battles we see, from the things we're told, the land of Israel, or Palestine as the Arabs would call it, is also important to them. Now, most Arabs are Muslims, and their beliefs are not, of course, based on the Bible, but rather on their holy book, the Quran. Whereas the Bible was written between around about 2,000 and 4,000 years ago, over that period of time, the Quran is somewhat more recent, having been written between 610 and 632 AD. So some 600 years after the Bible was completed. Now, you may know that there are many similarities between the Bible and the Quran. For instance, both speak of a 6-day creation. They speak of Adam and the first sin. Both speak of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David and Goliath, Mary and Joseph, John the Baptist, and the Lord Jesus, to name but a few. The Quran also records the events we've just read of Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son. Remember, we looked at that in Genesis chapter 22. So there are many similarities. The Quran, written later, has picked up on many of the events, many of the people, many of the records of the Bible, and incorporated it into the Quran. We recall when we looked at the Bible that it recorded that Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And we saw, didn't we, in Genesis 22, that it was Isaac that was sacrificed. And as we've just said, it is through Isaac that the promises, the covenants, were to be fulfilled. The Quran, however, has a different perspective on it. It too states that Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael, but it does not specifically state which son was sacrificed. But it's commonly believed by most Muslims that it was Ishmael who was sacrificed, that he was the special, chosen son, rather than Isaac, as the Bible tells us. And the Bible and the Quran begin to diverge further from this point. The Bible's focus remains with Abraham and with Isaac as the chosen seed, and Ishmael, we read, is sent away. But the Quran continues to provide details of both Isaac and Ishmael. And it too speaks of the peoples that descended from these 2 individuals. Now, regarding Ishmael's descendants, there are no specific details given in the Quran itself, but there are many historical and records regarding genealogies and so on, and found in various Islamic traditions and historical sources. Through these, Ishmael is shown to be the ancestor of the Arabs, of the Muslim nations. Ishmael is recognised by Muslims as the ancestor of several prominent northern tribes, as well as the forefather of Muhammad himself. However, in the Quran we also read about the descendants of Isaac, the Jews. Now, the Quran doesn't speak extensively regarding the Jews, but it does agree that the Jewish people descended from Isaac. So there is complete agreement between the 2 books. The Jews descended from Isaac, and many of the Arab nations descended from Ishmael. The Quran speaks of the Jews in a negative light. It reports instances of Jewish treachery against the Islamic prophet Muhammad. But the Quran also picks up on certain Bible passages. It agrees with the Bible record of the Jews bringing about the death of Jesus, as we can read from the Gospel records in the Bible. It also records, as does the Bible, how that the Jews killed many of their own prophets. And it picks up on passages which state that the Jews are to be punished for their disobedience. Many, but certainly not all Muslims, accept an interpretation that this punishment is to be meted out by Muslims. And this gives us a clue. This gives us one of the reasons why there is this antagonism between the Jews and the Muslims. And when we consider Jerusalem itself, well, we've already spoken of how the Bible states that it's God's special city and is therefore a holy city to the Jews. But Islamic tradition states that many of their key prophets, including Muhammad, were associated with the city. Parts of Jerusalem's significance to Muslims is linked to the city's strong association with Abraham, David, Solomon and Jesus. all of whom are regarded as prophets in Islam. Islamic tradition predicts that Jerusalem will play an important role in the future, naming it as one of the cities where the events at the end of the world will play out. So again, it is an important city to the Muslims. What about Israel or Palestine, the land as a whole? Well, for the Muslims, it's a home of many of their prophets. According to the Quran, the Muslim god Allah named it the Holy Land. Allah also selected it as the land for his chosen people, which all sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? It's traditionally understood by the Muslims that the chosen people is themselves. In the Quran 5 verse 21, we read, "O my people, enter the Holy Land which God hath decreed for you, and turn back on your heels, otherwise you will be overturned as losers." They are to enter the Holy Land that God had given them. By contrast, the Bible records that the God of Israel told Abraham, "And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." So both the Jewish and the Muslim religious books declare that God has given the land of Israel to them. It is therefore no surprise that these tensions exist in the Middle East. But if we go back in time, we can see that the Bible predicted this animosity long before Islam and the Quran even existed. Come back with me, please, again to Genesis, and we'll look at Isaac and Ishmael. We've already established that the Jews and the Muslims trace their ancestry back to Isaac and Ishmael respectively. We've already seen how that these two men were both the sons of Abraham. Let us look at some more details related to this. In Genesis 16, we read of the birth of Ishmael. And Ishmael, we'll recall, was the birth of Sarah's maidservant. The son was born to Sarah's maidservant, Hagar. But while Hagar was pregnant, there was a hatred that developed between Sarah and Hagar, even before these two sons existed. The exact wording here is a little confusing, at least in my mind, as to who was saying what in these verses here. So I've just colour-coded the verse here. So in Genesis 16 and verse 4, he, Abraham, went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she, Hagar, saw that she had conceived, her mistress, Sarah, was despised in Hagar's eyes. So we see that Hagar despised Sarah. But this wasn't a one-way thing. In response, in the second half of verse 6 of this chapter, we see that when Sarah dealt hardly with Hagar, she fled from her face. So Sarah treated Hagar harshly, we might say, as well as Hagar despising Sarah. There is this two-way hatred that has established between the mothers of these two nations. Later in the chapter, God sends his angel to speak to Hagar, picking up in verse 11 of this chapter. Genesis 16, verse 11. "And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man, his hand will be against every man, and every man's against his, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." And that description of not just Ishmael, but of the Arabs, has proven to be true. That word wild in verse 12 actually means wild ass. And the Arabs were historically a nomadic people who wandered around as a wild ass would wander around. His hand being against every man's is seen in the antagonism and violence towards the Jews. But equally, history has shown and continues to show many conflicts and disagreements between and even within Arab nations. And finally, in that verse, God declares that Ishmael will dwell in the presence of their brethren, which is exactly the situation we see in the Middle East, with most Arabs still dwelling in that area of the world in the presence of the Jews. Picking up in the next chapter, in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 20, we read these words. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee, behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. And that great nation that is spoken of in that verse is the Arab people. These 12 princes are listed for us, no need to turn there, but they're listed in Genesis 25, verses 13 to 15. And we can take these 12 sons, these 12 princes, and they can be readily linked to the Arabian peoples. Some examples, the names are listed there, and some of the links to some of the Arab peoples shown on the screen there. Again, we don't have time to develop that any further. So it is in these verses that we've looked at, we see that the Bible reveals to us the original source of this hatred. These two men, Isaac, he was a God-fearing man, a man who sought to do what God wanted. But Ishmael was a wild man who turned his back on God. We've looked at the world today and the current conflict, and we've looked right back over the history of these tensions, right back to the source of the two sons of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael. What, though, about the future? Given what we know, it would seem likely that this antagonism will continue. The current war is revealing this tension and even hatred, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the whole earth. Where will it end? Will more nations get drawn into this war? Will the ceasefire perhaps be agreed and Israel withdraw? Ultimately, how will this persistent tension and conflict be resolved? Well, we don't need to guess what might happen in the future, because once again we can look to our Bibles. The Bible is able to tell us exactly what will happen between the Jews and the Arabs in the future. It reveals to us that there will be a great battle centred around the Middle East. The signs are that this battle will take place very soon. But the great battle the Bible speaks of will be much, much bigger than the current Israeli-Hamas war. Most of the world's nations will be involved. It will be another world war. The Bible refers to this battle as the Battle of Armageddon, a phrase which has passed into common usage today. It's used by the world to speak of highly destructive, world-changing events. There have been films, books, computer games that have adopted this title. But what does the Bible say about Armageddon? Well, come with me to that psalm we had read as an introduction, to Psalm 83. The psalm, we can see, is addressed to God, and it relates to his people, the Jews. The Bible is clear that God's people is the Jews. Psalm 83 then, and reading the first 3 verses. Keep not thy silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. The verses describe a confederacy of nations that move against God's people, against the Jews. The words of these nations are recorded in verse 4 and 5. They have said, "Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee." These desires and motives, in particularly the words of verse 4, we see today in the Arab nations, a desire to bring an end to Israel forever. Many believe that the current call of "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" is another manifestation of the Arab nations' desire to eliminate Israel from the map. So who are the nations that this psalm speaks of? Let's just pick up a few verses. Verse 6. The tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon, and so the chapter continues. Again, we don't have the time to establish who all these nations are. Suffice to say, they largely speak of the Arab nations. And very clearly in that verse 6, we read of the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael. But this is not the only Bible prophecy of these events. Come over to Ezekiel, please, and chapter 38. This chapter also speaks of this battle of Armageddon. And this chapter shows that it's more than just the Jews and the Arabs involved. The chapter describes a great confederacy that comes against Israel. Reading from the start of Ezekiel 38, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. For the sake of time, we won't be able to go through this chapter in very much detail, but sufficient to say that these verses are speaking of a great power led by Russia, together with many European nations. Picking up in verse 5, we read of some of the confederate nations: Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya. Persia, or Iran, as it's called today, and Libya, we recognise, and Ethiopia in northern Africa. These are Arab nations, largely, joining with the Russian power. We can also look briefly at Daniel and chapter 11, please, which speaks of this confederate power. Daniel talks of Russia and the nations with them as the king of the north, which of course makes sense because Russia and Europe is largely to the north of Israel. Just picking up in Daniel 11 and verse 41, talking of the king of the north, we see that from earlier verses. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. The great power will enter into the glorious land, and that's a reference to Israel, because in God's eyes, there's no more glorious land than Israel. As the chapter continues, we read of this invasion. Verse 45. Talking of this great power, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Just stop there a moment. The glorious holy mountain is a reference to Jerusalem. And so we're being told that Russia and its allies, many of whom will be Arab nations, will overrun the whole of the Middle East, in fact, and set themselves up in God's holy special city of Jerusalem. But God will not allow that to continue, because that verse 45 continues, "Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him." That confederacy will come to an end, and none will help him. Indeed, if we just go back to Psalm 83, those words also speak of the coming to an end, the destruction of this great power. Psalm 83, and just picking up in verse 13. "O my God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind, as the fire burneth the wood, and as the flame setteth the mountains on fire. So persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with thy storm." Words there of destruction that talk of the bringing to the complete end of this great power. Indeed, we could go to Ezekiel 38 and also see how God speaks there of a destruction of this great power. The Bible is therefore very clear about future events that will befall the Jews and the Arabs. And when we look at the world news, we do see these events starting to come to pass. Russia is becoming more involved and physically ever closer to the Middle East. There was a report from the European Parliament in 2018 that was entitled "Russia in the Middle East from Sidelines to Centre Stage." And there's some very interesting quotes from that, which again, for sake of time, we'll have to pass over, but I'm happy to share those with you afterwards. There are other events in the world, such as Brexit and the war in Ukraine, that are all signs to people who understand and look to Bible prophecies that this battle of Armageddon is coming close. And so it is then with the war that we see in the Middle East, with the unrest elsewhere in the world, with the Bible predicting that the Middle East is going to erupt into a world war, then this might all sound very scary. But in reality, we don't need to be afraid. Because this world war we have spoken of, the Battle of Armageddon, is all in God's plan. Everything leading up to it, all the events that are taking place at the moment, are all being brought about by God through his angels. We can take comfort that God is in control. But more than that, God has revealed through other prophecies in the Bible that once that great destruction of Armageddon is over, then God will bring about great changes upon this earth. The wickedness, the violence that we see all around us will be wiped away. The issues of this world, such as pollution, disease, and ultimately even death itself, will be taken away. The Bible describes this time as the kingdom of God, a worldwide kingdom reigned over by the Lord Jesus Christ, a time of peace and security, quite unlike the world we see today. In the last book of the Bible, we read these words: "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." Young people, brethren and sisters, you and I have an opportunity of being there in that kingdom. God has declared in the Bible the things we must do if we desire a place within his kingdom. And so I would encourage you to read the Bible, to listen to other addresses such as this, to talk to the brethren and sisters, the aunties and uncles, to learn from them what they believe about the Bible and the things we have talked of, so that in the mercy of God, you too may come to a knowledge of God's truth, that we may all be baptized, being saved from sin and death, and in God's mercy receive a place in his kingdom.